All right, here we are again. Now we're talking about social policy. Hopefully you watched the video on economic policy. I don't know where you are in your video watching, but here comes this one. And one of the things that social policy is important to social policy is understanding where it fits in terms of economic policy. You literally could do it all as one lecture, and if you were taking this course, physically at CBS, it would be part of the same night of lecture because they are intimately intertwined. For that matter, the third part in the lecture, after talking about the micro-level activity relationship between individuals and government in terms of economic activity, overcoming the errors in terms of producing stabilization, make sure the economy goes the way it's supposed to go at a moderate pace, and making sure that the economy grows, is then achieving certain economic goals. Namely, providing for those who are left out and providing for public goods. But I'm going to get to that in a moment. So we talked about how in the economy we're concerned about provision. That's spectrum, poverty, prosperity, moving people along, moving the society along to that. But again, economists think of the world as being limited and zero sum. In the sense you take from one, you then are given to the other. And that's the way the world works. And we talked about last time, or at least in the economic lecture, where that's not a Christian's concern because we believe in a God who can provide all that we need according to his riches in Christ Jesus. But just looking back to the early U.S. economic policy, had a very limited role, the government, in the economy. Laissez-faire philosophy, that's the same thing as free market in French, laissez-faire, free market. Was very popular in the sense that government stayed out. One of the things in progressive, what was so notable of the progressive era, which was the end of the 19th, heading into the beginning of the 20th century, was the government starting to get involved in the economy. Trying to curb some of the ravages of the barons, the big businesses on the economy. And how we saw that it was really the states where all the action was in terms of government regulating the economy. Labor laws, all labor laws, whether it was age, the length of the work week, worker protection, all those, that was state. That wasn't federal government. That was state government. And then the major economic issue for the federal government was tariffs, basically taxing goods that came from abroad, from other countries, into this country. So, very different than nowadays. And so the other part to remember, at least where I put this slide up, is especially when you talk about the social safety net. So when bad things happen to you, who did you turn to? Who helped you out? Before this time, before the New Deal and the Great Depression, you had this philanthropy by association. This idea of literally I would be provided for, or that help would come from the community of people that I belong to. Churches obviously were very popular, or very prominent during this phase. For that matter, education started as a church-provided business. Hospitals started as church-provided business. But it was by association. And what's most important about that is not everybody was part of the association, or not everybody was part of an association. And so there are several gaps in this provision. I mean, you were lucky if you were, or fortunate if you were, but if you weren't, and bad stuff happened, because bad stuff happens, exactly, you're kind of out of luck. So, with the New Deal, and remember the New Deal came ushered in by the Great Depression, which had started, if you will, at least 3 years prior. The central idea of the New Deal was that the federal government could step in. So when these bad things happen, who can step in? Federal government. But the political cynic would say that the other reason why the federal government got in is to those politicians who were advocating for this, it won them a lot of political favor in terms of elections. So let's keep on going. So remember, when we talk about strengths and weaknesses from the economy lecture, if you haven't watched that one yet, you probably should go back and watch that one to give you some ground here. But here's the key here. This ignorant of the defenseless. In a market system, if you're hurting, you're left out. And in a command system, it can be quite equitable. And so one of the reasons why you have this centralization of power in the presidency and in the bureaucracy and in the federal government is this idea of trying to make more equitable the outcomes, and especially to provide for those who had been hurting through the Great Depression. I mean, it's a very real crisis. Not trying to argue that it was lack or momentary reasons. No, this was substantive reason, but nevertheless, that's the cause. And one of the things I want to characterize what this government activity was and what it wasn't. Well, let's talk about what it wasn't. So all this new activity in terms of social safety net is not what we call distributive policy. Distributive policy, if you remember when we were looking at the equation of the economy, the GDP, GDP equals consumer activity, business activity, and government activity. Distributive policy is more the government activity, meaning the spending by government to provide for the things of government, the things we need. So when we're buying roads or national defense, paying for our national defense, that's just ordinary consumption of government. Okay, that's just government providing the services we need government to provide. All right. Typically collective goods, public goods. We're going to come back to that in just a moment. All right. But then what this new activity involved is what we call redistributive policies. And this is very much so, there's a reason why we use the term redistribute, where we redistribute the funds. Remember how in that last slide I showed the equitable. This was our efforts to be equitable, to take from those who have a little more, to give to those who have a little less, to redistribute the funds. All right? Some policies having a combination of this, college aid, in the sense that obviously we need to provide for college, but the college student benefits a little bit more directly. And the person who's not the college student but still pays their taxes, they don't benefit as much. All right? I'm sorry. We're skipping a slide, a very important slide. Forgive me. Let me get to this. Yeah, I don't know why it's hidden. Let's get to this slide. There we go. All right, sorry about that, y'all. But it's very important to understand what types of goods we're talking about here, and that's why I focused on the word collective goods. So when we talk about private goods, shoes, clothing, even housing to an extent, this is something that the market can deal with very well. Private goods are those goods that we can exclude people from it, usually by pricing mechanism. Either you have the price to pay for it or you don't. And if one person is enjoying it, nobody else can. So if you're living in the house, we don't have room for 18 other families to live in that house. If you are wearing a pair of shoes, nobody else can wear those pair of shoes. All right? So we can exclude, or maybe better yet, we don't mind excluding. Like that, that seems fine to us. No one thinks it's bad that we haven't distributed your shoes to everyone in society. We think that's fine. You can have your own pair of shoes. And no one should be able to take your shoes. So private goods, we have, and largely around the world, there's not too much difficulty with private actors providing private goods. So even in some of the more communist systems, Marxist systems, I should say, where the government owns the means of production as well as makes the decisions, they'll often let small shop owners still handle the provision of private goods. But they do tend to keep those shops small. And tend to control how much money those shop owners make. But nevertheless, they let the market, if you will, handle that. Where the government tends to come in is especially on what we call public goods. Club goods, we still, satellite television being a good example, we can price people in and out of that. Even though if you have cable TV or satellite TV, that doesn't keep me from having satellite TV. There's enough capacity out there for everybody. Internet is another example. There's enough capacity out there for everybody. But we can price people in and out, and we seem to be okay with that. So those are club goods. Common goods would be an example of more like a beach, where you don't want to exclude anybody from it, but there's only so much space. Schooling, public schooling, or any schooling for that matter, is a lot like this. You don't want to exclude anybody from getting their primary and secondary education, but you put too many kids in that classroom, that educating function doesn't work as well. So government tends to come in here, though we've allowed some market type of innovation for that, but especially in the public goods. And really you could characterize both of these. Where we don't want to exclude anybody, then almost, I don't want to say almost always, but in across the human experience of countries, we tend to see government step in there as opposed to leaving that in solely private hands. All right. So, and it shows up in our redistributive policies, where to pay for those goods, we have to get government involved. And why do we have to get government involved? So this is a very key answer. I hope you're paying attention to this. This is an answer to essay questions and other questions in your in your exams and in your homework. Collective action problem. Anytime you're dealing with a public good or a common good where you don't want to exclude anybody from it, how do you get everybody to pay for it? Or at least to pay their fair share? Government. You let government get involved to use their power, their authority, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, their authority to police people and literally to take your life and your livelihood if you don't cooperate, if you don't pay your fair share to the provision of this public good. That's why we talk about redistributive policies. And the number one mechanism by which we are enabled to do and provide these redistributive policies is taxes. So I talked before in the President lecture about how we had instituted passed the amendment, U.S. Amendment, Federal Constitution Amendment, to allow the income tax during the Progressive era, but it was under the leadership of FDR in 1943, where we expanded the income tax to be on all U.S. citizens, and everyone pays basically a portion of their tax to the U.S. federal government, straight to the U.S. federal government, for the U.S. federal government to then do what they will with it. All right. Progressive versus regressive, meaning progressive is the more you make, the more you pay in taxes. Regressive being the exact opposite, where people who don't make as much are paying a larger portion of their income to taxes than people who make more. So we're always fighting that. But interesting enough with taxes, and I put these up here just so you know, sales taxes and property taxes are not federal taxes. Those go to other governments. Sales tax, at least for us locally, sales tax goes to the state of Texas. Property tax and to the city. Property tax to the counties and to the city and some of the local governments like school districts and governments like that. Customs and customs duties and tariffs, that's solely federal, only to the federal government, collects customs and tariffs. And then inheritance tax is a mix of state and federal. Federal government definitely has its one. Some states have an inheritance tax as well. But just getting back to our subject of social service spending. So when we say social service spending, we're talking about all those policy areas where literally we're taking from some to give to another. So Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, housing, education, a lot of health care. Almost all of this is social welfare spending. And notice what has happened. Since the 1940s, obviously we had none of this prior to the Great Depression, very little, philanthropy by association, that's why I make that point, and it just shoots up. Just shoots up. Notice Medicare and Medicaid, when they came around under LBJ, on their own trajectory, if you will. And the problem with it, if there is a problem, is this, deficits. Deficits being where the federal government, and any government for that matter, any government can run a deficit, though our state governments, by their own constitutions, cannot run a deficit. They cannot plan to spend more than they plan to take in taxes. They have to balance their budgets. But every other government doesn't have that restriction. Local governments, federal government, no such restriction. And largely we've been spending on deficit spending, meaning we've been intentionally planned, acknowledged, understood to be spending more than we make. And before we get on our high horse and say, darn that government, any of us with credit card debt, we're doing the same thing. We are spending more than we make, and on purpose. Problem is, if those deficits accumulate, you get the national debt. Let's just look at that a little bit. So talk about deficits again. You were just taking it back to JFK and his time. So deficits as a percent of GDP, whereas below the line is how much more we're spending than what we're making. And you see it spike. Actually, it was spiking under Reagan, and then Reagan put in his reforms to try to move us back there. But then we launched a war under George Bush Sr., which kept us down there. But then under Clinton, actually, and the Republican Congress, we got to a surplus, one of the few surpluses we've seen in this modern era. And then, of course, with 9/11 and the Iraq War and those things, right back into deficits. Looking at that accumulation of debt as a percent of GDP, again, just measuring it against how much we produce as an economy, we were actually getting that debt down right after LBJ and into Lincoln, Nixon in his term. Same thing with Carter and into Reagan. But then with the arms buildup under Reagan, we start building that debt back up. Again, under, under Clinton and the Republican leadership in Congress, we see that debt coming back down, but then George Bush, 9/11, and the Iraq War, and it starts shooting up again. And then, of course, the Great Recession in 2009. It starts shooting up massively. All right. So when we talk about social policy, there are schools of thought on this. And it's very important to understand what these schools of thought are. So all of it has to do with the role of government in providing these social policies, meaning the role of government in redistributing this income to get more equitable outcomes, to come to the aid of the defenseless, if you will, in the economy. There is a very, I won't say very, an ancient, if you will, school of thought that says the government should stay out, period. Whether it be economic activity, whether it be social activity, there is no role for the government in any of that. That's the libertarian mindset. It really does stem from Adam Smith, way back in the 1750s, 1770s. That in a natural state, men are of their own, they will form their own associations. And really when libertarians and conservatives to an extent say the government should stay out, they're not saying that this shouldn't be provided. They're just saying it shouldn't be provided by the government. And the government shouldn't be taxing everyone to make sure that it is provided. That there is a third actor, the civil sector of society, that should be providing this. By civil sector or third actor, we mean first actor is government, second actor is business. Third actor is everybody that's not government and business. So churches and private associations and community sports leagues and those kind of groups. That's civil society, even the media, which we'll talk about last week. So that's the libertarian. Conservatives share with the libertarian that in terms of the economy, yes, government should stay out of it. Where the conservatives differ, and I don't like Coleman's table here, not that necessarily that the government regulate, but more, at least on the conservatives, that the government recognize what civil society has already determined. So let's use an example to play this out. Abortion. 1970s, Roe v. Wade. Conservatives would argue that society had already made a determination. The values in society at that time said that the life of the child is to be preserved and respected. That was the judgment of society at that time, that the life of the child is to be respected. And therefore, their argument would have been government should recognize that. It's not government's place to be the moral compass of the society in terms of that. So that would be the conservative argument. Now, don't get me wrong, that same conservative argument was used against civil rights legislation against African Americans, or in favor of African Americans, restoring to them all of their rights to vote and things like that. The conservative argument was, again, these are societal values. It is not government's role to be the moral compass of society, but rather it is, this is society's job. But the civil rights movement was able to appeal to those same implements of society, namely the Constitution, to to force the government to recognize that, yes, certain governments and certain segments in society wanted to continue discriminating against African Americans, but as a country, there were arguably more who wanted to restore a full civil rights and civil liberties to African Americans. So, but nevertheless, the whole argument in the conservatism is not government's role to be changing society. Government should be reflective of what society is, or what are the values of society. Liberal mindset is exactly the opposite. That it is the role of government to move us towards a more just society. You've heard those terms, a more just society. It's a liberal term. That there is a more just end out there, and that it's an appropriate activity of government at the very least, if not the appropriate activity of government, to help move us there. Not only in social behavior, but also economically. If we need to redistribute so that we end up with a more equitable, more fair society, it's appropriate for government to do that. If we must basically change they would call closed minds of certain parts of our society so that more individuals are allowed more freedom, then it's appropriate that government do that. If not, it's the role of government to do that. But as Coleman likes to point out, this divide between liberals and conservatives is the major divide. So when political scientists look at groups of politicians and how they congregate over policy, which is of course what we were focused on this week, that divide, liberal and conservative, is the major divide, number one divide in every single voting scenario, every single government, every single regional and federal location. That is the debate. The role of government in terms of the economy, in terms of society, even in terms of the other policy areas, civil rights, civil liberties, and in foreign affairs. Now, foreign affairs kind of has its own dynamics, which don't necessarily line up conservative, liberal. And if you have any questions about that, I can talk about that if we want. But the reading on that probably should be sufficient. But especially on everything else, this is the big divide. So make sure you understand where you stand, and you're going to have homework assignments where you're going to look at what the parties say on these matters and try to figure out where they stand and compare that to where you stand. Because a lot of us vote a particular party but have a different stance, liberal versus conservative, social policy versus economic policy, than that party does. And so I'm challenging you to examine yours, examine your parties, and see where you all line up.